Hi everyone, welcome to the next episode of the LiveO2 for the People podcast. My name is Jenna Ochoa and I am your host as usual. Today is going to start off a little bit different. I wanted to let you all know that I have re-recorded pieces of this episode because when we recorded this episode, which I guess it's been over a week or so now, I was attempting to do it from my car. I was traveling and I've afterward found out that my audio was not the best. So what I'm going to do is re-record my pieces of the interview and splice those together with Tom and our guest Scott Stapleton's original audio. So if it sounds odd to you, like it's edited, that's because it is. But trust me, you will thank me for the much better audio quality that I'm getting here now at home. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and intro today's episode. Our guest today is going to be Scott Stapleton, and Scott is a regional rep for an equipment company you guys may be familiar with, Keiser. And if you've ever done a LiveO2 demo, you will have demoed on a Keiser bike. Now, Keiser is kind of a cool company because they approach fitness in a different way, in a different manner than most other equipment companies. And how they design their systems, it's based on pneumatics. And Scott's going to get into the nitty-gritty of what that all means later. But basically, pneumatics is where, from what I understand, is where an individual leverages compressed air to get their workout instead of a more standard weight setup. So using things like iron weights that we are more accustomed to seeing in gyms. So Scott's really going to help explain exactly what pneumatics means and help redefine some of the terms we're used to hearing when it comes to athletic training. So this episode is going to be very athletic focused. Even if you don't identify as an athlete, I would highly encourage you to listen in. You'll probably learn a thing or two, but I just want to remind you that the principles that LiveO2 is built on apply to any human being. So as long as you can breathe air, so I would encourage you to still listen in, even if you're not an athlete, and let us know what you think afterwards, if it helped you or not. So with that, I'll go ahead and get into the intros and start with our VP, Tom Butler, who most of you know if you have been listening to our podcast. So Tom, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and about your involvement with LiveO2.
Sure. Tom Butler. I've been with LiveO2 for quite a while here since we launched out into the public. More recently, tasked by the universe to start breaking people out of their shells and getting them to be participants in their health. And we've had the pleasure of, meeting Scott, getting to know him, and the knowledge that he has being in the fitness industry for, what are we looking at, 30 years, Scott, is just, it's one of those things
absolutely.
where 30 years, we start to put together, hey, here's the ultimate, and that's what we get really excited about in terms of teaching teams how to train different and educating ourselves. There's a lot to learn here about the most effective way to train. LiveO2 is a great tool, and then you combine that with something like Keiser, and you really have something that's on the next level. So Scott, Keiser is known for having good science. I mean, it's why we love the M3i bike at the events. It's a nice belt drive, magnetic drive bike. It's got good, outputs on it as far as it'll tell us watts and mets and everything we need to train. But I learned from you recently, there's a whole nother level to Keiser. And this is what Jenna was talking about with the pneumatics. So what is it that Keiser has discovered there in good science that is moving this whole space forward?
So, pneumatics lets you train with the same force, but you can move it at much greater velocity and therefore increasing your power output.
Right.
And if you look at Isaac Newton's second law, force is equal to mass times acceleration, and then plus mass times gravity. So these guys were looking at, using mass in the equation of Newton's law. They were focused on using the same mass and they were trying to control the acceleration forces with the cam. So what Dennis did is, instead of using mass, he used compressed air, and he reduced the mass in his design to where you didn't have to try to control accelerations. You can train at any speed you want. And then you also don't have to deal with the gravitation forces of the acceleration of gravity, because we know that gravity is it's constant at 9.8 meters squared. So, along with, anything vertically that goes up iron-wise, depending on how high that weight stack goes, your gravitational forces are going to be so much greater coming back at you. And so essentially, they found that using iron, you not only cannot accelerate through the range of motion, you have to decelerate through portions of the movement pattern, which doesn't allow you to get full acceleration of the muscle tissue. And then you have to be able to overcome that gravitational force plus the mass coming at you.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to stop it at your weakest leverage position, which creates greater impact to the joint and connective tissue.
Right.
So with Keiser, you don't have those outside influences of momentum, gravity. I can train at any speed I want neurologically where I'm at without the ill effects of high impact forces coming back at me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's great about Keiser. So we allow you to train slow, fast, powerful, you name it. You can train 5 different ways with our equipment. Unlike iron, you're restricted to just train at one speed, and you get one benefit to try to build strength. But when it comes to life or athleticism on the field, training slow doesn't transfer onto the field. You've got to train fast and to play the game. So neurologically, why would I train slow in the weight room and then try to get myself to move fast out on the field? It just doesn't transfer. So that's why Keiser was developed, to work with elite athletes, to allow them to train at the greatest force that they can handle at the greatest speed. They can use that force, and that's what builds true power. Mm-hmm.
So when we start talking about this pneumatic type of equipment, you're calling something a cam. So for our listeners and myself, what is a cam?
Well, a cam is it's a variable radius device to basically the cable that travels around a pulley system allows you to lift that weight vertically, but then it travels around a cam, which is trying to slow down that mass so the acceleration forces don't get out of control to where that weight stack flies up in the air. And then not only do you have to stop it to keep it from going too high, you have to decelerate, and then you have to deal with the fact that it's going to come down at such a great force. Well, the cam is supposed to slow the acceleration forces down
Mm-hmm.
As it travels over a radius profile, to where it creates greater force to the weight stack and slows the speed of the movement down. If
So
that makes any sense.
Well, I guess what I'm picking up from it, it's basically a mechanical component of the equipment that makes it safer, but allows it to function in a way that you guys get the benefit you want out of it.
Right. It alters the lever arm distance to the resistance of the weight stack as it's moving through the range of motion.
And these are things these are things you think about as a 30-year veteran looking at equipment and how to get more out of it.
Right.
I look at it and I think, oh, that's pretty neat, and I tend to go on how it feels, and for me, that's the interesting thing. Keiser equipment feels so good in terms of the way it moves. So when you get into this design of an equipment and having better science, there are a couple terms that I wanted to see if we could take a shot at, because it seems like a simple thing to say, oh, this is what strength is, but really there's some physics here. So if we look at these terms and talk about them, I think our listeners will have the idea, and start to develop, okay, this is an advantage to have, speed and force and power defined a little bit differently. And, the work that I'm doing gives a different feel. But in terms of power, how do you guys define that?
Well, we know that power, the equation for power is force times velocity. So, for an example, I know if I was to accelerate a certain amount of iron, once I overcame its inertial properties, it requires less force to continue to accelerate it. But I have to apply greater force, more than what it actually weighs, so which potentially creates greater risk for injury during the initial movement. But once I get it moving with iron, momentum is helping it carry it away from me, so I require less force, which generates less strength and less stimulation to the muscle tissue, and then I have to decelerate it. In Keiser's case, we use a variable resistance cam. It starts light, and then as it travels through the range of motion, it kind of mimics the same thing as a cam profile, to where it changes, allows you to train through the range of motion, to where the muscle is more mechanically advantaged once it's through the range of motion, because you're not at for example, a 90-degree position of the knee joint, which doesn't incorporate a lot of muscle tissue. It's just a lot of tendons around the joint. But once I move that leg through the range of motion, now I'm incorporating more muscle tissue, which then it mechanically allows me to be able to handle greater resistance. And that's what Keiser does. It starts light, gets heavy through the range of motion, that you're at a better mechanical advantage muscle-wise, and then it gets lighter at a contracted effort. So by doing that, I can train, because I'm not dealing with mass, I'm dealing with compressed forced air. It's 100% pure force. It never leaves my joint and connective tissue, because it doesn't have momentum or inertial properties to where it's going to move away from me or fly away from me, to where I have to decelerate it. So that compressed air stays with the limb through the whole range of motion, to where I can constantly train at such great velocity, and it's never going to come off my limb and cause any kind of high impact damage as it comes back down on top of me, like it would with an iron weight stack does. Because once it goes up, it's got to come back down, and somebody's got to stop it as it's coming back at you. So that's the difference, if that makes any sense. So we know that power is defined by, it's equal to force, the amount of resistance you're using, times the speed or the velocity. Now, you can also define power as defined by the amount of work divided by time. So the greater work you do in less time, it's also equals to greater power output.
Yeah, and force is one of those things that's in each of those equations. So how do you define force, Scott?
Well, force is the amount of resistance that you're using against the body for strength-related movement, or what type of resistance is being applied to the body to where you have to overcome that resistance.
And what I start thinking about is, okay, if you're in a weight room, people start thinking about pounds as force, but there's so much more to it. So in terms of summarizing what Keiser has done for strength training, all of these things, power, force, speed, and work, all come together. Seems like Keiser took gravity out of consideration, and they've come up with something different. So
what companies have done is try to control the acceleration forces of mass because it causes a high impact of resistance to the joint and connective tissue when you're trying to control that acceleration of gravity coming back at you. So what Keiser did is, instead of dealing with iron, which everybody is dealing with in this country, is they decided to use a different form of resistance, which is air, compressed air. And by doing that, you take Newton's law and you take the mass and you reduce the mass to a smaller amount of resistance. And then this allows you to accelerate a force that doesn't have momentum, in that it also protects the body from the gravitational accelerations of gravitational forces, because that mass is, that greater mass is not going to come down at you, and you have to stop it at your weakest position. So with compressed air, you don't have momentum and gravity in the equation of pneumatic resistance. So this allows you to train at full speed and through the full range of motion. You can accelerate that force through the whole range of motion and never having to decelerate or slow it down, which creates greater hypertrophy of the muscle tissue, bone density, greater strength, increases in the muscle tissue, because of time under tension. That creates hypertrophy. It's all about time under tension. The longer the muscle's being stimulated, the greater blood flow to the muscle tissue and the greater hypertrophy of the muscle is going to occur. So with iron, it's a variable resistance. It's all over the place, and you're going to get high impacts, and it's going to create greater joint loads in a negative way to the connective tissue, and you're not going to get as strong because your force never stays with you through the range of motion of iron, unless you train at very, very slow speeds, which nobody does. Mm-hmm. Nobody moves so slow.
Yeah, one of the first things that I saw, I guess a video of your pneumatic equipment, an athlete was on the leg extension. And I've never seen anybody doing a leg extension like this before, because he was literally seated, but his legs were going like he was running, like full speed. And I was like, wow, that's the first time I've ever seen somebody doing strength training at that speed. And it clicked. And in my mind, I was like, okay, I finally know what Scott's talking about here. There's a whole different mechanism at play that, it really becomes the way you want to train to go into an event, because that's what's happening in an event. It's not gravity based, it's force based.
Right. That's right. So, and that's what compressed air does. It allows you to train at any speed that you neurologically can train at, and it gives you the opportunity to create the greatest power that you've been able to not be able to do on iron. And that's the new hot thing right now in this industry, is it's all about power development, because if you read into anything related to sarcopenia, wasting of the muscle tissue as we age, the first thing that the human body, or the muscle that disintegrates the quickest and accelerates with aging, is your power fibers. And believe it or not, that actually starts declining, disintegrating in our mid to late 20s, believe it or not. People think it's we lose our strength in our late 50s and 60s, but actually it starts occurring early on in life. Our power fibers are the first to go, and then our strength starts, we start losing a certain percentage of strength every decade we age. So those two muscle fibers, your strength and your power fibers, are things you have to hold on to. And Keiser is the only equipment that allows you to train those two fibers more effectively than anything out there in the market. So if you really want to slow down the aging process of the human strength, the body, Keiser allows you to train with the greatest force and the greatest speed you can move at, to maintain a lot of those power fibers that you're losing already as we're speaking today by not doing any kind of power training.
I mean, you just explained something that I now have a term for that I think has been something I'm experiencing. I'm in my early 40s, and I know that I know what it was like to be strong, and I know I'm not as strong. And I know I haven't been training it either. And that's the intriguing thing. When I saw this equipment, I said, wow, that is, that speed. When you see somebody on this equipment, it almost looks like they are doing cardiovascular training. So to some some degree, it is relying on cardiovascular ability to do this type of speed and force training. And that's where this idea of the ultimate starts to come up. And Scott and I were talking about this. I said, Scott, how do we put LiveO2 and Keiser together? And that's when you mentioned the Air Runner. And that was something I'd never seen before. Can you describe that equipment for us?
Yeah, so our Air Runner, it was designed to allow athletes to just to accelerate at a 45-degree angle. Where you start your phase of running, you tend to go into a 45-degree angle when you want to accelerate or sprint. And so what we've done is designed a machine that allows you to sprint without touching the ground, and you're actually loading the posterior chain of the body, which is the backside, the glutes, the hamstrings, and quadriceps, and allow you to just sprint. And what's cool about our machine is it actually measures distance in yards, so we can tell you to sprint 15 yards and see how much power you can generate with each quad, each leg, and we can see if there's a deficit from one leg to the other. It's a great rehab tool to see whether or not, if somebody just injured their hamstring or quad, and we want to see that we know that strength comes back way sooner than the nervous system. Well, to really challenge the nervous system, we've got to create greater velocity and to see what kind of power output he's going to generate. So, but it's a great anaerobic piece. And just imagine if we train these athletes at a high altitude, and just had them sprint for 15 seconds, high altitude, and then flush them with oxygen to recover. It would be really tremendous to see what kind of anaerobic endurance we can generate with these athletes for, getting back into the huddle and recovering so much quicker than without the oxygen. It would be really kind of interesting to see what kind of outcomes we can get with that.
Mm-hmm. And this is this is innovative stuff here. We've been in a fair amount of pro facilities, and we're always encouraging them to combine LiveO2 with other pieces of equipment. But there is an absolute science to getting your legs to move really fast and to be really strong while you're doing it. Now, one thing that all the pro teams will tell us, and we get tired of hearing it, but from their scientific perspective, it's really true. Their sport is anaerobic. And the more they can train those anaerobic pathways, they feel like the performance is going to be better. And what Scott and I are kind of twisting our minds around is, okay, if you're going to train anaerobic pathways, go ahead and put somebody on -O2 and shift them into being fully anaerobic and, train those pathways at a greater percentage.
So Tom, I want to go ahead and interrupt you here and ask you to please define anaerobic. I know a lot of our listeners may already be familiar with those terms, but if you wouldn't mind taking a second for those of us, myself included, who aren't very clear on what those terms mean, if you could just explain each one a little bit.
Absolutely. So when we get into aerobic, and this is where LiveO2 lives a lot of the time, we're basically trying to recover people from life, right? Aerobic is our metabolism that requires free oxygen. And it's related to or involving energy production where we are utilizing oxygen. And when we're doing aerobic training, we are focused on improving, or in some cases, we're only intending to improve, and we don't actually really improve it, but we're intending to improve the body's cardiovascular system that transports and gets oxygen into our cells. And that's where we live. Basically, if we aren't breathing enough, then we're going to be short on our free oxygen. Now, it's not always the case that we have enough oxygen to do the work that we need to do when we need to do it. For example, running away from a bear. This is where we have anaerobic pathways. It's not our primary pathway, but we do have them. And in some cases, they're really strong, which usually means you probably have a nice athletic propensity. And if they're not as strong, then you might realize, okay, I'm not as strong of an anaerobic athlete, but I can do things like go for a run at my own pace. And, that's primarily an aerobic event. So anaerobic is relating to metabolic processes that happen in the absence of oxygen. And it's not that your body is 100% one way or the other. It's always a combination of. And what we're talking about with LiveO2 is the ability to actually push the body further down an aerobic pathway, or in the case of what we're talking about today, in anaerobic based training, we're talking about pushing the body's ability to perform with less oxygen. So we're shifting the physiology more over to the anaerobic side. And the goal there is you're not trying to improve the body's absorption or transportation of oxygen. You're trying to improve the body's ability to have, force and speed and strength over a short duration of time. And that's what all the strength coaches are concerned with for folks that are playing, mainly your contact sports, your football, your hockey. And that's where the performance lies for those sports. But everybody has to recover aerobically with oxygen. You have to come up for air.
So, Scott, how would you explain the benefit for these guys that are basically preparing for their next season with LiveO2 Adaptive Contrast and the Keiser Air Runner?
Well, obviously, anytime you can build your anaerobic endurance in a way that really challenges you in a safe manner, I think that our runner would be just a tremendous device for any sport, whether it's hockey or football or even baseball when they're trying to run the bases. But training them at higher altitudes, which a lot of endurance athletes tend to go out west to train in higher altitudes to increase their lung capacity. I mean, you won't need to do that with the O2, LiveO2 and Keiser. We can actually train you anaerobically right in your facility and flush you with greater oxygen levels to where your recovery is going to be so much quicker, which is going to help you do more sets and more repetitions. And essentially, I have to think that that's going to carry over onto the field and give you a greater anaerobic threshold, but also can allow you to build so much anaerobic endurance that you're going to last so much longer on the field than your average guys who don't use this system in our training methodology.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning. There are, I'll say, at least 8, pathways for the body to create energy between aerobic and anaerobic. And athletes tend to be different, and they tend to have some special anaerobic abilities that most other people don't have. and what's interesting, and that's what is trained primarily and developed primarily. So they have those special anaerobic pathways that are doing a lot of the work production. And if we recover their aerobic pathways, then we have the whole set, which makes them a much stronger athlete. What we see when we train the teams that come to town in Denver is they are running all of their physiology off of these two special anaerobic pathways. And they're gifted in that they have those pathways, but when we bring on the aerobic ones, basically 6 or so aerobic pathways, we're putting them and their physiology in a place where it has the maximum ability to perform. And it's a huge difference. And it's just a matter of, I think there's a blind spot in the training where, when they don't have that aerobic recovery, this is where we, go down the road of having more injuries and less performance and slower reaction times, simply because they're running on a special gear set, but it's not the complete gear set. And really, the interesting thing to me is you mentioned the elevation. We're teaching athletes how to prepare beyond room air, and Keiser is adding back in, the force and the speed equation. This ought to be the making of, whatever, the super athlete or the ultimate, war fighter, whatever you want to name it. But there is challenge and recovery. And the places we want to go to get that, they do look different. And they are always evolving. Scott, what do you see, in terms of training? Where are the areas that people can improve their knowledge and improve their methodology?
Where do I see people needing to find the information?
Well, just in terms of, yeah. So a lot of times when we look at facilities and how they're training individuals and what they're trying to accomplish as a program, we see a lot that is very similar to what was happening 30 years ago. So if you can offer some innovative advice to steer them into what they might consider doing differently in their training to improve their results and performance on the field, with your 30 years of expertise, where would you lead them?
Well, to me, safety comes first when it comes to training athletes, and I just feel that a lot of strength coaches in this industry are so fixated on iron and actually doing Olympic lifts, and these guys it's such a technical lift that it's potentially there's more downside than upside. So when they're trying to build anaerobic endurance, they're using Olympic lifts to build that endurance, try to move as much force as they can and get underneath it, and then throw it up in the air and then allow it to come back down. There's a tremendous amount of damage going on with the skeleton of that athlete, and with the risk of doing more damage than good for the long-term longevity of this athlete to continue his career in this game. For me, Keiser provides the best alternative because we're not asking you to do a technical lift. All we're going to do is put you in a position that allow you to train the best you can based on where you're at strength-wise and neurologically-wise, to provide the greatest force and the greatest speed that you can provide in a machine that's going to cause absolutely very little impact to the joint and connective tissue, and it's not going to be it's going to allow you to train at such an accelerated speed that you don't have to worry about the actual technical movement of the pattern. to where it's going to jeopardize you mentally to where you're going to slow down. So neurologically, it's going to benefit you far more than using iron. So when you ask that question, to me, it's all about where can I train safely and put myself in a very safe position, but allow me to use the best strength that I have in a safe manner, that it's not going to hurt me in any way or risk any kind of injury. So that's what pneumatic does, and that's what air provides you, is the safety component that iron could never provide.
Yeah, I'm thinking of one of the folks we've worked with, and he was with the Cirque du Soleil out in Las Vegas. And it was an interesting thing when he said, when you see us on stage and we're doing a triple flip, it means behind the scenes, we can actually do a quadruple. And if you take that theory and apply it to training, you're not always training for what you're going to be performing. And the best performers are actually training beyond what their performance requires. And this is an interesting thing when we look at Olympic weightlifting programs. They are technical lifts, but the training to do that lift is not really doing that lift. I mean, it sounds like that is a big component of what you're saying, is train smarter. Mm-hmm. And your technical component will be safer.
Right. That's exactly right.
And if we take that to the field, if we can train someone, for a performance event, a sport event, if we're training them in a way that provides them with a better anaerobic advantage of being able to produce more force and speed over a time period, I mean, that's got to translate on the field, right?
Absolutely. You train for the game. You don't, the problem is in this country, in the collegiate or even professional weight rooms, or even in high school, they're all fixated on trying to build so much strength. And we know by adding more muscle mass, muscle weighs 4 times as much as fat. By adding more muscle mass to the skeleton, it will slow you down. Now, if you're going to be an offensive lineman and you want to build that diesel engine, well then, you can focus on strength component and not worry about the speed, because most likely that lineman's not going to run down the field to do anything other than just try to block. But needless to say, the majority of the athletes, the game is all about the speed, who can get there quicker, who can outrun a certain competitive player. So the speed of the game is so critical that by training slow in the weight room doesn't transfer over onto the field. And that's what Keiser allows you to do, is actually train for the game that you're playing. So whether you're a golfer or you're a linebacker or a running back or a baseball player, we allow you to train for the speed of your game, and that's neurologically, that's what it's all about. Is you train the brain to play the game. So
yeah,
that's how I see it.
As we're talking more about this, I can't think of any other way where force and speed are combined together in training.
So guys, I'm curious to know at what point or how early or how far in advance do you start training an athlete prior to their competition or their season? And also, could you walk us through maybe what a typical training session looks like?
I think that's a great idea. Instead of a LiveO2 plus a Keiser bike, Scott, can we do a LiveO2 Air runner? Or sorry, a LiveO2 plus an Air runner?
Absolutely.
All right, so Jenna just brought up the idea of, let's see what this looks like if we were going to dissect it. And Scott, at some point, we're going to put these two pieces of equipment together and film it for people, because in my mind, it is the ultimate setup. But Scott, if we're just throwing around ideas in terms of the Keiser Air runner protocols, how would you go about combining that with LiveO2 to get this phenomenal result that we want to take to the field?
Well, obviously, the nice thing about LiveO2 and Keiser, the machines are easy to set up in a very easy setting. And I see it as doing, putting the load on the athlete of what their body weight is, and then having them to accelerate, for 15 seconds at high altitude. And then I can see, obviously, injecting the oxygen for recovery, and then doing at least, in my opinion, a 15-minute session, and then see what kind of power output he is able to generate the next time around when he utilizes this device. I can only imagine that his power output is going to be so much greater because anaerobically he's going to build a greater anaerobic endurance. He's going to fill the muscle tissue with greater oxygen blood flow, and the recovery is going to be so much greater, but also the voltage or the mitochondria is going to be elevated through that process. So it could be pretty exciting to see what these guys will be able to generate power-wise as they continue to train with this type of modality. I think it should be great.
And typically when you train athletes, how far in advance to a season or to a game do you start?
Well, I mean, you look at pro football, they, unfortunately, they only give them, because of the NFL players agreement, they're only able to train them with maybe 2 months prior to games or a month and a half. So they got to cram everything in, and that's why you see a high injury rate, because these athletes are just not conditioned and not prepared. Some of them come into the camp very deconditioned, and so there's a high level of injuries because they're training them with iron and not preparing them for the speed of the game. And you see a lot of hamstring pulls and groin pulls and ankle tears, and they're just unfortunately I think in general you need at least 90 days, 3 months of conditioning to prepare the body for the game, especially when you've sat around all winter or during the off season not doing anything to keep yourself in good physical shape.
Yeah, and I think the preparedness in this scenario where we're using something like the Air Runner with the LiveO2, this is a longer duration approach. Like Scott mentioned, 3 months or 90 days to get this strong physical response. So we're supporting the body, but we're also tapping into a way that we can challenge it beyond really anything it can experience on the playing field. This is a little bit different than when we go into the aerobic training and the recovery training prior to events, but this is a longer, more durable training process where we're playing the long game with these guys, saying, okay, let's see if we can build anaerobic pathways beyond what you're currently gifted with. Okay, so Scott, if we're going to wrap it up real quick, we've got like a whole nother webinar easily on talking about the pathways. If I had to summarize that, day to day, we're designed to use oxygen. So our aerobic pathways are really smart for sustained energy and recovery. Anaerobic is a whole different animal where we can create a lot of work really quickly without even attempting to use oxygen. Body has different metabolic pathways where it can simultaneously be using oxygen and not using oxygen to produce energy. When we train with LiveO2, most of the time we're refreshing the aerobic pathways so the whole system can be stronger. When we work on a longer duration, we're actually challenging the body to create anaerobic pathways so that it knows how to create these big bursts of energy and this work output. And that's an important part of a balanced physiology.
Well, like you said, Tom, that could be a whole webinar or a whole another podcast, maybe around two with Scott in itself. So I want to be respectful of everyone's time. But before we wrap up, Scott, I was just wondering if you could let our listeners know where they could learn more about Keiser products.
No, absolutely. So obviously, if you go to Keiser's website, www.keiser.com, you can see all of our product information online there. You can also very well easily YouTube Keiser Runner, and you'll see it actually in action. You know, but I do appreciate everybody's time and effort to allow me to speak on behalf of Keiser, and look forward to working with LiveO2 on seeing if we can develop some great outcomes with the runner and see what we can get athletes to accomplish in a short period of time.
And for our listeners, Scott, where is your facility located? Maybe one of our listeners would like to be the guinea pig on the Air Runner LiveO2 combo.
Yeah, it's actually, we're located in Milford, Ohio, 930 Lila Avenue, and which is right outside of Cincinnati, called Miami Athletic Club.
Well, Scott, thanks for spending some time with us. I know you have to go, and we've probably stretched this and we could talk even more. Thanks for sharing your knowledge. It's rare that we get to spend some time with an individual that has 30 years experience in something, and clearly that's leading us to some new innovations in the way we're thinking and using both Keiser and LiveO2 to produce what I think are going to be some phenomenal results. I can't wait to take it to some people with you.
Great. Thanks, guys. I got to go.
Okay. Thanks, Scott, for your time and educating our listeners about pneumatics and how Keiser products work. And we hope somebody out there would like to be our guinea pig on the LiveO2 plus Air Runner project. So let us know. For those of you listening, I will link up to everything in the blog post as usual. And we will see you on our next episode. Thanks for joining in, guys.